Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive deep. Today, we're tackling a topic that's super intriguing to me, and I bet a lot of you can relate. We're going to be talking about what it really means to be a highly sensitive person, or HSP for short.
And I'm excited to jump in.
I've been checking out this YouTube series, PASeando, created by joanmonse, who, get this, only discovered he was an HSP at age 55.
Wow, 55. That's quite a journey. What's his story like?
So Joan always kind of felt different, like he was experiencing everything so much more intensely than everyone else. And it wasn't until he hit his 50s, facing burnout and just feeling overwhelmed, that he found the words to describe what he was going through.
Makes you think about how important self-discovery is no matter what age, right?
Totally. It's like finding that missing piece of the puzzle that suddenly makes everything click into place.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that being an HSP isn't about being, sensitive in the way we usually use the word.
Yeah, it's not about getting easily offended or anything like that.
Exactly. High sensitivity, or sensory processing sensitivity, is actually a neutral trait, like any other personality trait, and it comes with its own unique strengths and challenges.
So how can someone tell if they're just, sensitive, or if it's something more like high sensitivity?
Right. It can be tricky to tell. Joan actually breaks it down into 4 core characteristics, kind of like a fingerprint of an HSP.
Oh, I like that, a fingerprint.
Yeah. So those 4 characteristics are depth of processing, overstimulation, emotional intensity and empathy, and sensitivity to nuances. They can all manifest differently in different people.
Okay, let's break those down a bit, because depth of processing, that sounds kind of intense.
It can be. Think about it this way. Joan talks about being in social situations, and he's not just listening to the words people are saying, he's picking up on all the unspoken stuff too.
Whoa, like reading between the lines on a whole other level.
Exactly. He's processing the emotions behind the words, the subtle cues in people's body language. His brain is wired to analyze everything on a deeper level.
I can see how that would be both amazing and totally exhausting.
It definitely has its downsides. It's actually one of the reasons HSPs are often prone to overstimulation, which is the second characteristic. Imagine being at a concert, but the volume's cranked up way too high. That's what everyday life can feel like for an HSP.
Especially in environments with lots of sensory input, right?
Exactly. Bright lights, strong smells, loud noises. And it's not just physical sensations either. Because HSPs feel emotions so deeply, they can get easily overwhelmed in emotionally charged situations.
It's like emotional overload.
And this ties into the third characteristic, emotional intensity and empathy. They pick up on subtle emotional cues, sense the mood of a room, and feel deeply moved by art, music, nature. They really experience the whole emotional landscape with that same heightened sensitivity.
Okay, on to the fourth characteristic, sensitivity to nuances. How does this one play out?
HSPs are all about the details. They notice the subtle changes in someone's tone of voice. It's about picking up on those fine details that often go unnoticed by others.
So 4 core characteristics, each one pretty powerful on its own. But how does this actually work in a person's life, like day to day?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, right?
Totally, because it's one thing to understand the theory, but how do you actually live with this heightened sensitivity?
Right. One thing Joan talks about a lot is self-care, really important for everyone, but especially HSPs.
Makes sense. If you're processing everything so intensely, you're probably going to burn out faster.
It's all about recognizing your limits and making sure you're recharging. Just like we need to plug our phones in, HSPs need to find ways to unplug and recharge their own batteries. But Joan actually talks about creating a sensory sanctuary in his home.
Sensory sanctuary sounds very official. What does that look like?
Basically, it's a space that's designed to be calming and peaceful, a place where he can escape from all the stimulation of everyday life and just decompress.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've got self-care, setting boundaries.
Joan actually talks about this really interesting approach to mindfulness.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's Joan's secret to inner peace?
Well, he touches on meditation, but then he has this unique twist. Remember, HSPs are all about the nuances.
Oh yeah, they pick up on every little detail.
Exactly. So Joan, he taps into that through music.
Music. Interesting.
He's been a musician since childhood, and he finds that focus on detail, the precision of playing an instrument, and it channels all those intense emotions into something beautiful. And get this, it doesn't stop there. Joan's also into, wait for it, magic.
Magic? Like pulling rabbits out of hats? Magic?
Well, he's a mentalist. which might sound surprising.
Until you think about the focus it takes.
Right. Crafting illusions. For Joan, it's another way to step away from the everyday chaos, find that flow state.
So it's about finding those activities that make you forget the world around you. And for Joan, that's music and magic.
It all comes back to mindfulness, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not one size fits all. It's about finding what makes you feel present and at peace.
It really is. And speaking of finding peace, it makes me think about relationships.
Ah, yes. Love and HSP is always an interesting topic.
Because with all that intensity, how does that translate to romantic relationships?
It's funny you should ask, because that's exactly what Joan dives into.
Lay it on me.
And there's this big question, right? Should HSPs only date other HSPs?
The whole birds of a feather debate.
Exactly. But Joan says there's no easy answer.
Because every HSP is different.
Right. And I think it's where Joan's insights are so valuable for everyone, whether you identify as an HSP or not.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Spill the tea.
So he gets really honest about the challenges he's faced in relationships, especially this idea of falling into an emotional dependence trap.
The emotional dependence trap. Now, that sounds a little ominous, but also I get it. What does that mean exactly?
Well, think about those core HSP traits we talked about, the empathy, the desire to avoid conflict, the ability to tune into other people's emotions.
All good things, right.
They are. But they can also lead to some tricky situations in relationships. HSPs might find themselves overgiving, prioritizing their partner's needs above their own, trying to fix their partner's problems, or even silencing their own feelings to keep the peace. And while this comes from a place of love and care, it can create an imbalance in the relationship.
Right, because then it's not a two-way street anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Joan talks about how he used to fall into this trap, feeling responsible for his partner's happiness while neglecting his own needs. It wasn't until he started setting healthier boundaries and prioritizing his own well-being that he was able to create more filling and balanced relationships.
So it's not just about understanding your own sensitivity, but also recognizing how it shows up in your relationships?
Absolutely, and that's a valuable lesson for anyone, HSP or not.
Okay, I need to take a minute to process all of this relationship wisdom.
It's deep stuff, but it's so important for building healthy and happy connections.
Now, before we move on, I do want to address one more thing about HSPs, the idea that they're all introverts.
Ah, yes, the introvert myth.
Because that's not always the case, is it?
Not at all. In fact, Joan himself identifies as an extroverted HSP.
Whoa, really? So he's out there socializing and meeting new people?
He is. He thrives on social connection and loves being around people. But like all HSPs, he also needs to be mindful of his energy levels because he's more easily overstimulated.
So it's a balancing act.
Exactly. He's got that double whammy of being energized by social interaction, but also easily drained by it.
That's so fascinating. I never thought about it that way. It makes sense, though. Like, you can be drawn to something and also need to manage how much of it you expose yourself to.
And Joan actually mentions that about 70% of HSPs are introverts, while 30% are extroverts.
I guess it's a reminder that you can't just slap a label on someone based on one aspect of their personality. There's always more to the story.
Always. People are complex, and HSPs are no exception.
Speaking of complex, I know some of our listeners might be wondering about high sensitivity and things like anxiety or even aggression. Did Joan address those topics in his series?
He did, and he makes a very important point about aggression. It's not an inherent trait of HSPs. In fact, he argues that HSPs are actually more likely to shut down or withdraw when they're feeling stressed.
Which makes sense, given their heightened sensitivity to everything.
Exactly. They might become quiet, retreat into themselves, or try to avoid conflict altogether.
So it's more of a flight response than a fight response.
But, like anyone, HSPs can experience anger or frustration, especially if they've been pushed beyond their limits. It's all about recognizing those triggers and finding healthy ways to cope.
You know, it's really got me thinking about how we understand each other, or sometimes completely misunderstand each other, all because we don't always have the right words for what we're experiencing. Like Joan going through life feeling so different and then finally discovering he was an HSP at 55, that's huge.
It really is. Yeah. And it shows how powerful self-knowledge can be.
Because before that, it sounds like he was constantly trying to fit in, trying to change himself to fit this mold that wasn't made for him.
He talks about feeling like he was always swimming upstream, and then discovering this whole concept of high sensitivity. It's like he finally gave himself permission to embrace who he was.
Strengths and challenges, all of it. So for our listeners who are just starting to unpack all of this, what would you say is the biggest takeaway, the most important thing to remember?
I think it's that Understanding high sensitivity isn't about putting people in a box, labeling them. It's really about understanding the amazing diversity of human experience. We all have different heights, different eye colors, different personalities.
Different shoe sizes.
Right. And we all have different levels of sensitivity, too. It's just another part of what makes us unique.
Yeah.
It's part of what makes each of us special and valuable.
Joan shares a lot of great advice for navigating the world as an HSP, but honestly, a lot of it just sounds like good advice for anyone, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of high sensitivity, I want to leave our listeners with this question. How would our interactions change if we really understood these different volume settings and approached each other with that in mind?
Something to think about, isn't it? What if instead of judging or labeling, we led with curiosity and compassion, recognizing that everyone experiences the world in their own unique way?
Now, that's a world I want to live in. So until next time, keep those minds curious and those hearts open.